Elvis, Bohemian Rhapsody, Straight Outta Compton, Blonde, Rocketman, and most recently, Michael. Why is Hollywood churning out so many biopics almost every single year? The industry is bogged down by an abundance of safe commercial movies where there is little to no room for funding or original to low medium budget profits, and biopics play into this. Maybe we should slow it down a bit. Claiming a movie is based on a true story is the best way to get the audience interested. Biopics have a murkier relationship with the truth as they go with the philosophy of never let the truth get in the way of a good story. This is inevitable in film, as screenwriters are not generally fact-checked but are noted on how to make the screenwriting more compelling. And this can make biopics hard to understand because we question whether the audience are meant to be educated on the facts or merely entertained. Is it unfair to the real people invoked to give an unreal account of the situation? We're going to find out. Now, with the recent Michael movie, everyone, and I mean everyone, was talking about the film, Michael Jackson, and biopics as a whole, me included. Like, I've seen the film twice. But I actually want to discuss the whole genre more, and Michael in particular. Because why are biopics so popular, and should we be upset if they don't tell the whole truth? Now, before I get into this video, I want to say that this is not a film review, okay? This is not a film review, but just a film breakdown of some things that I've noticed that clearly you have to since you're clicking on this video. So I want to say that I will be talking about other films. I will be talking about Elvis Presley, Bohemian Rhapsody, Raging Bull, what's love got to do with it? Because we can't talk about Michael as a biopic if we don't talk about past biopics that have done exceptionally well, if we don't talk about Elvis that got major criticism, if we don't talk about Bohemian Rhapsody, if we don't talk about darker biopic interpretations like Raging Bull and what's love got to do with it, that took risk in actual cinema. To talk about Michael as a film is to talk about so many biopic films in history that literally are the reason why Michael was made the way it was made, why Michael was potentially sanitized, while the real story behind Michael Jackson didn't get the true coverage it deserved. Before I get into this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe. This is going to be probably one of my longest videos, but it will definitely be worth it. Please do make sure that you subscribe to my Substack at Serena the Journalist, where I write about culture more frequently than my YouTube videos because these do take long. Without further ado, I'm Serena the Journalist, and this is me discussing Michael and the issue with biopic films. So let's just get into it. What is a biopic? A film historian, George F. Coston, notes that it's a genre that's been embedded in Hollywood from almost the beginning. A biopic can take many forms. It might attempt to cover an entire life or focus on a single defining period. The only constant thing is that it centers on a real person, using their name, identity, and recognizable history as its foundation. That familiarity is a key part of the appeal. Audiences are drawn to the stories they feel they already know or think they understand. Biopics can elevate and celebrate their subjects, but they also serve a clear commercial purpose. They are often reliable box office performers built on existing cultural interest, and they frequently position themselves as awards contenders. In that sense, the biopic sits comfortably between art and industry, offering both prestige and profitability. You rely on the legacy of a singer and use that to compete with each other. From the beginning, the genre has been tied to acts of recreating real events through performances, which raise a central question. What is gained by having actors reenact a life that already happened? In theory, casting performers allow filmmakers to add emotional texture, perspective, and immediacy. And this turns historical fact into lived experiences, where the audience can feel moments rather than just learn about them. However, in practice, this recreation often becomes less about interpretation and more about recognition. Biopics exist not as artistic expressions, but also as commercial products. They are designed to attract audiences through familiarity, prestige, performances, and awards potentially. And in that sense, the point of many biopics is dual: artistic storytelling on one hand, but also profitability and award recognitions on the other. Film is both an art form and a business, and that biopic sits precisely at the intersection where real lives are shaped into marketable narratives. In the traditional acting sense, as we all know, actors can use style, physicality, and interpretation to build something richer than what's already written on the page. Biopics shift that entire dynamic. Instead of starting from within a character, actors are often required to work outwardly, based on research, footage, and documented behavior. And as a result, the performance becomes less about interpretation and more about replication, especially the representation of known mannerisms and iconic moments. This is where biopics rely heavily on audience perception. We are encouraged to believe that actor has become the person, even temporarily, and that becomes part of the film's appeal and marketing. Performances are often framed as deep immersion or transformation, even when they are built largely from imitation of existing material. Like, I feel like we've heard so many times that an actor became the person they were playing, that they really had to get into their mind, and for some reason that draws us to the film as well, to see how well did Austin Butler play Elvis? How well did, oh my gosh, the guy who played Ice Cube, how well did Ice Cube's son actually play him? And so because of this, biopic acting often rewards impression over invention. This also changes the actor's responsibility. In fictional roles, an actor might redefine how a character is perceived, but in biopics, however, the character already exists in the public imagination. And so the actor is no longer shaping a new identity, they are competing with an existing one. Portrayals like Schindler's List, for example, allow performers to construct a presence rather than replicate one. But for globally recognized figures like Michael, that freedom disappears. And so many biopics are produced with the involvement of a subject's estate, family, or close collaborators, which inevitably shape how the story is told. This often results in controlled versions of events and one that prioritizes image over complexity. And we all know how complex these stars are. The focus shifts towards presenting a hero narrative built from highlights rather than contradictions. And therefore, uncomfortable or ethically difficult details are often softened, reframed, or literally left out entirely. These omissions are rarely accidental. They actually reflect a desire to maintain a broadly appealing, emotionally satisfying portrait of the subject. And this is part of what makes a biopic about Michael Jackson so complicated. His life contains contradictions and controversies that cannot easily be excluded without distorting the overall picture. When filmmakers attempt to compress an entire life into roughly 2.5 hours, the result often becomes necessarily reductive. Years of development, conflict, and change are reduced to montages, milestone moments, creating a rhythm that moves quickly from one highlight to the next. This structure leaves limited space for inferiority. The supporting world, agents, producers, industry, machinery often become background texture rather than meaningful exploration. And while audiences may not always be invested in every logistical detail, there's still a gap left unaddressed. The desire to understand what was happening internally during those moments of extreme visibility for the stars. That is often missing from these films. Not the events themselves, but the inner life behind them. Instead of a cinematic interpretation of a person, we are frequently given a compressed summary of their public record. And what many viewers are really searching for is not always the outline of a life, but the sense of what it actually felt like to live it. Part 2, the greatest hits, Elvis and Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, as much as I love Bohemian Rhapsody, the film, okay guys, I'm not a hater, I'm just analyzing. I did love the film, but just because I love it does not mean that I'm not gonna critique it and have my opinions on it, which some of it can be negative. The deeper problem with Bohemian Rhapsody's greatest hits structure is that it doesn't just simplify Queen's history, it actually replaces casualty with completion. Some expected more drama, some expected more grit, and some critics noted that the film didn't go nearly enough in depth into Freddie Mercury and the other band members' lives, but was merely a collage of Queen's greatest hits. And instead of showing why Freddie Mercury evolves creatively or emotionally, the film jumps between already iconic moments as if his life is pre-edited. The scenes exist less to develop character and more to arrive at recognizable cultural endpoints. The creation of the songs, the tension with the band, and finally the Live Aid performance, which was a great performance, by the way. And so this creates a strange emotional flattening. Because the audience already know the songs and milestone, the film doesn't need to build tension in a meaningful way. It just needs to get there. And this film, despite its success, was a global hit, earning $911 million worldwide against a relatively modest $52 million production budget. And on top of that, it performed strongly in award seasons, winning 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Rami Malek. The film, written by Anthony McCartan and directed by Bryan Singer, with uncredited director Dexter Fletcher, who took over after Singer was fired, was criticised for missing a lot of the main intel of Freddie Mercury and the band. But Sheila O'Malley wrote, "Bohemian Rhapsody is bad in the way a lot of biopics are bad. It's superficial. It avoids complexity, and the narrative has a connect the dots quality. This kind of badness, while annoying, is relatively benign. However, the attitude towards Mercury's sexual oppression is the opposite of benign. The tension of being a gay man in the 1970s are not handled or even addressed. He himself seems unaware of his own sexual desires." Zara Ahmad also wrote, "In the movie, there is a montage sequence chronocycling the various gay clubs he went to with his snake-like personal manager, Paul Prenter. Almost immediately afterwards, Freddie exhibits signs of illness, followed by an official diagnosis. The link was too deliberate for me, almost presented as a condemnation of his sexuality, which is how many people viewed homosexuality during the AIDS epidemic at the time. In reality, Freddie's sexuality and his diagnosis didn't have to be depicted as mutually exclusive. And though I don't think the film intended to mean harm by this, I can't help but think the sequence was distasteful." Bohemian Rhapsody doesn't give us anything of Mercury's childhood in Zanzibar, his schooling in Mumbai, his lifelong devotion to rock and roll. The movie shows no years of dedicated practice or earlier musical life or ambition. His sole effort is a song that he scribbles on a piece of paper and keeps folded up in his pocket while working. Rafa Guzman of Newsday compared the movie to the satirical biopic Walk Hard. "By rights, this ought to be a glammed-up, sexually charged, 4-octave blowout. Instead, it's a stilted, stagey, hopelessly corny biopic. The kind of thing Walk Hard was meant to prevent. Yes, key events and key songs are covered. The composition of We Will Rock You, MTV's squeamishness about the video for I Want to Break Free. However, the band's massive success as a global touring juggernaut covered in a series of glitzy montages which don't really have any of the smarts or good grace to set themselves up or attempt to capture the madness of the life on the road." And the film ends by Queen's fabled Live Aid performance in July 1985. And the director's decision to recreate the full 20-minute performance at Wembley Stadium as a hyper-realistic concept film within a movie is where Bohemian Rhapsody packs a real emotional punch. Yes, the movie is about Queen, but also about the state of Freddie Mercury's heart. And by all accounts, Freddie Mercury's life was marked by 2 major relationships. First, his 9-year relationship with his fiancée Mary, then his relationship with his hairdresser Jim Hutton, which lasted until Mercury died in 1991. And so the movie makes it appear like Mercury suddenly flipped a sexuality switch. One minute he was cuddling and intimate with Austin, then he was with Hutton. But in reality, Freddie was already sleeping with Hutton. And so the movie eliminates the reality of Mercury's sexually fluid natures, just like Queen's management once did, to preserve the band's image in an era when a gay frontman would have meant doom. Mercury biographer Leslie Ann Jones said, "Queen's management spent decades trying to convince the world that Freddie was heterosexual while he was alive, but then conceded to his homosexuality after he had died. All their efforts to preserve Freddie in memory as effectively a straight man who was in love with one woman, his soulmate Mary, but who was corrupted by factions of the music industry are ridiculous to me. He was clearly bisexual." Even Malek agrees that the criticism that Bohemian Rhapsody underplays Mercury's sexuality. He said in an interview, "Believe me, there were conversations left and right about how to incorporate more of that story into this film. It was something I pushed for as much as possible and repeatedly brought to the attention of producers and directors and everyone who would listen. If it were me, I would have loved to have incorporated more." And so the film places Freddie's salvation squarely in the heterosexual members of his personal life, his band members, who were all completely blameless, squeaky clean angels who never do anything wrong, ever. Brian May and Roger Taylor, who were part of Queen and also involved in the production, insisted on protecting a part of Freddie Mercury's past and legacy. Biopics are controversial in nature, as we know, because people are controversial, and so much of what's considered fact is unfortunately determined by the court of public opinion. Even the title isn't even Queen or Mercury, it's the title of their signature song, you know, the one that makes a lot of money. Historical accuracy and truth were not exactly the highest priorities of the film. And so it also has to be said that none of us really know anything about the fellow band members, and if I didn't research them for this video, I wouldn't have even remembered their names. Yeah. The very fact that May and Taylor took a story about Freddie Mercury, not just their friend and bandmate, but a real life human being, and made it about how they think he should be perceived would be bad enough. But the true arrogance comes from when you realize that their presence in the story seems to be twofold. They are there to be morally perfect in the face of Freddie's transgressions and write Queen songs. So no, May and Taylor weren't trying to tell a story about grief. They were trying to tell a story about how they wrote Queen songs. And when they realized they couldn't get enough people in a story just about that, they perverted the biopic about Freddie Mercury to be about that instead. And this has a direct impact on the narrative, such as the band is portrayed as largely unified and principled, where internal conflicts are simplified or redistributed, as Freddie Mercury's struggles are framed in ways that don't implicate the group too heavily. For example, tensions and timelines are altered so that Freddie appears more isolated in his decision making, which subtly preserves the image of the band as stable and collaborative. This often pushes films towards safer, more conventional structures because a clear, familiar formula is easy to complete and market. So the result is a film shaped by multiple controlling forces: band members protecting legacy, producers aiming for mass appeal, and a disrupted production needing clarity and cohesion. And all of that fits directly into the greatest hit structure. The narrative avoids risk, ambiguity, or harsh critique because its purpose isn't just storytelling, it's creation. And the film is both an enlightening and highly entertaining portrait of a man who lived large on the world stage, not really letting us into the man who went back behind the curtain after every show. Now, the same thing can be said for the movie Elvis, which came out 4 years after Bohemian Rhapsody, and I believed followed the same blueprint to get major success for the film and its main actors to get some of the biggest awards, such as the Oscars and the Golden Globes. But just like Bohemian Rhapsody, Elvis was a film that just glorifies him and did little to no effort to humanize him, not show the outwardly context on why he was seen as the king of rock, which even that in itself is problematic. Elvis features a cast built around performance and transformation, reinforcing its stylized approach to biography. At the centre is Austin Butler, who plays Elvis Presley. Butler's performance is very immersive, focusing on voice, physicality, and stage presence to recreate Elvis as both a cultural icon and a vulnerable individual. His portrayal carries the film, especially in musical sequences that blur the line between performance and narrative. It's so funny because this guy actually changed his whole accent to speak like Elvis.
To not talk how I am right now, but my voice sounds different when I talk to my dog or when I talk to my dad or when I'm here right now.
Opposite him is Tom Hanks as Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis' controversial manager. Hanks plays Parker with a heavy theatrical style, presenting him as manipulative and controlling, which shapes the film's framing of Elvis' career as something orchestrated and constrained. Olivia DeJonge appears as Priscilla Presley, offering a more grounded and emotional counterpoint to Elvis' increasingly chaotic life. And together, the cast supports a narrative that is less about strict realism and more about spectacle, memory, and myth, aligning closely with the film's hyper-stylized greatest hits approach. The director, Baz Luhrmann, and his co-writers used the story of Elvis' supremely crooked manager, Colonel Tom Parker, to frame the larger, more glorious, and more tragic story of Elvis. In the film, there's a modern-day fascination with superheroes. When the Colonel asks Elvis to tell him where he got a certain quote, Elvis says it's from one of the superheroes in his favourite comic. Even though Elvis probably liked comics as much, allegedly he had more interest in church and Jesus as a youngster than he did comics. He loved singing gospel and often performed spirituals at church. Until his last days, he always performed a gospel song or two during his concert. He didn't want to be called the king because he said Jesus was the only king. But we didn't get any glimpse of his Christian side in the film at all. The African-American juke joint and the church are always shown as only yards away in the depiction of Elvis's musical influences and could barely tell the difference between the two types of music. Black characters are mere background players in the story. We don't see his friendship with his background singers, the Blossoms and the Sweet Inspirations, which included Whitney Houston's mother, Cissy, or his friendship with peers like Jackie Wilson. The project is not so much a real-life biopic of Elvis seen through the eyes of Colonel, as proclaimed in promotional material for the film, but instead a deconstructive rendition of the Elvis legend as conceived by the four screenwriters. In her review of the film, Zach Eric writes, "As a strict 100% factual biopic, Elvis is probably a failure. But as a biography of an idea, it's as much of a triumph as you could hope for. A work of controlled and sustained mad love for an artist whose story is never ending. Jack Hamilton writes that, in particular, the movie's approach to race, surely the most controversial and forever unsettled aspect of Elvis's legacy, is gallantly obtuse. Black characters exist as props whose primary function is to vouch for Elvis's own mythic racial transcendence. The movie's depictions of black music making often feel racist, shot after lyrics shot of carnal, frantic ecstasy, while whole traditions like gospel, blues and R&B are reduced to raw material for Elvis to bring forth his white masses. One especially strange scene features Elvis fleeing hordes of fans to catch Little Richard performing Tutti Frutti, an encounter the movie depicts as a moment of Promethean discovery for Elvis. But Tutti Frutti was already a national hit before Elvis had even released a single on RCA. Many Americans, white and black, had heard Little Richard before they'd ever heard of Elvis Presley. Many people before this movie didn't know the extent to which Elvis was influenced by black culture, and many diminish him as an artist because of it. Was it influence or was it stealing and then repackaging it in a way to appeal to white audiences? The movie portrays it as pure influence and how it was organically repackaged to appeal to white audiences. I've actually heard the story that Elvis told a white Southern reporter that the only thing black people can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes. It was a cruel comment that, if true, revealed the ugly side of the man born and raised in Jim Crow, Mississippi. And I ask, should this side of him be told? Lama makes it clear that Presley and many other famous musicians and bands took much of their music and owe much of their fame to African American musicians and singers, but they were only blatantly recognized and never compensated for their work. B.B. King, played by Calvin Harrison Jr., and Little Richard, played by Alton Mason, appear in the movie, but the chance to dramatize their work and Presley's discovery of them was also blown. As we all know, since his fandom, he has been seen as an allegory for the things much bigger than himself as a person, for the social revolution of rock and roll, for newly dangerous modes of adolescent sexuality, for the white exploration of black culture, for a particularly American imagining of self-making and self-destruction. He was trapped between symbol and symptom, an endlessly refreshable canvas for what other people want to think about him. Elvis did get much of his influence from black culture, and he tied it in with his own personality and love for music to become the music legend and cultural influencer that he was. And with that, he owes it all to the black community. There was so much that the film missed and could have explored more, but obviously for the sake of time, that's not always possible. For instance, in the film, Priscilla looks a lot older than 14, and by today's standards, it's scandalous that Elvis dated Priscilla when she was only 14. But unfortunately, during the 1950s, it wasn't unusual. Jerry Lee Lewis, Sam Cooke, and many more dated and even married underage girls. The difference in Elvis and Priscilla's ages conveys Elvis's need for control. This kind of character flaw is what makes for sustained drama in a story. This film prefers to present Elvis as flawless, which deflates the energy of the film. From Variety, Owen Gleiberman said, "What Elvis never quite shows us, at least not until its superior second half, is what was going on inside Elvis Presley. For a while, the film played like a graphic novel on amphetamines, skittering over the Elvis iconography, but remaining playfully detached from his soul." He concluded that Luhrmann has made a woefully imperfect but at times arresting drama that builds to something moving and true. By the end, the film's melody has been unchained. Spring Daily's Tim Grierson said, "Butler isn't very successful in suggesting what Presley was like off stage, in part because Elvis' screenplay tends to zip through crucial moments in his life without offering much insight." The movie goes to pains to depict Elvis as a man of liberal conscience who is deeply moved by the various political and social crises faced in the United States in his lifetime, but whose activist inclinations are repeatedly thwarted by Parker. The film is nice to look at and listen to, but the intense sugarcoating of his character ends up a detriment to the truth behind the man, which is ultimately a more moving and powerful tale. The film was also made with the involvement of the Elvis Presley estate, including Priscilla Presley. That kind of access allows for music rights and personal detail, but it also subtly guides the narrative away from anything too destabilizing. Elvis is framed sympathetically, often as someone shaped and constrained by forces around him, rather than fully responsible for his decline. Another key production choice is the narrative framing through Colonel Tom Parker. By making Parker the narrator, the film externalizes blame, presenting Elvis' career and downfall as something managed, manipulated, and commodified by someone else. And so when we even think about how much other people have had to play in the making of the film, it's very hard to see the film as something that is perfect, as something that we can even see as truly real. And this is the issue with the greatest hits phenomenon. It makes it seem like we only need to look at the big shows and we only need to consider the hit songs and what makes some of these people considered the greatest of all time. And this is why if biopics continue to stick to this framing, it risks humanizing the actual person they're meant to be portraying and still putting them on a high pedestal that has even more of a drastic decline. darker interpretations, Raging Bull, and What's Love Got to Do with It? Raging Bull is a dark interpretation of boxer Jake Mulata's life because it rejects the idea that a biopic should explain or redeem its subject. Instead of framing his boxing career as a rise and fall story with clear lessons or emotional closure, the film traps the audience inside cycles of self-destruction that never fully resolve. And for many, the film is seen as one of the best sport biopics of all time. What makes it especially dark is its refusal to separate success from violence. LaMotta's professional achievements are constantly entangled with jealousy, paranoia, and brutality, especially in his personal relationships. The film suggests that his greatness in the ring cannot be disentangled from his inability to control himself outside of it. The film stars Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta, and his performance was so good that he won an Oscar for Best Actor, and was directed by the great Marty Scorsese. But when Marty was really making it, he really wondered if it will ever be released. "We felt like we were making it for ourselves," he said once in an interview. Scorsese and De Niro had been reading the autobiography of Jake LaMotta, the middleweight champion, whose duels with Sugar Ray Robinson were a legend in the 1940s and 50s. For Scorsese, the life of LaMotta was an illustration of a theme always present in his work: the inability of his characters to trust and relate with women. And the filming was so complex. The fight scenes took Scorsese 10 weeks to shoot instead of the planned 2. Robert Edgar actually wrote in 1998 that the fights are broken down into dozens of shots, edited by Schoonmaker, into duels, consisting not of strategy, but simply of punishing blows. The camera is sometimes only inches from the fist. Scorsese broke the rules of boxing pictures by staying inside the ring and by freely changing its shape and size to suit its needs. Sometimes it's claustrophobic, sometimes unnaturally elongated. The film is the most painful and heart-rending portrayal of jealousy in the cinema. It's actually a really good film that I've seen, just about like low self-esteem and sexual insecurity and fear that leads some men to abuse women. Boxing is just the arena, it's not the subject. And so the film has a certain honesty that only a few other films in history of cinema could match. Not only is Jake not a saint at times, he's a pretty much unlikable character from the beginning. Josie McBride, the film critic for Variety, said, "Martin Scorsese makes pictures about the kinds of people you wouldn't want to know. And this fact is what makes the characters in the film so compelling. The director takes flawed individuals and portrays them as humans and shows their motivations and insecurities. These chaotic people capture our sympathy because the film speaks a universal truth. Everyone is flawed one way or another." Raging Bull transcends from being just a movie to becoming a piece of art that is how biopics should be. We should see the entire film as a separate work of art. Kathy Morality, who played LaMotta's wife, Vicky, in the film, gave a great performance, transforming from a teenage girl being courted by the boxer to a grown woman who's fed up and tired of a marriage that is full of domestic violence. In the film is the "I'm the boss" domestic confrontation between Jackie and Vicky, and the scene Jack interrogates Vicky about infidelity, and the conversation escalates from suspicion to control to humiliation. The scene shows how the film refuses the standard biopic logic. There's no boxing success counterbalance in these moments. His public greatness never justifies or redeems his private violence, and the domestic space becomes an extension of his psychological instability. And instead of separating career Jake from home Jake, the film collapses them into one continuous state of aggression and insecurity. The film doesn't pull any punches. And stylistically, the use of claustrophobic framing and repetitive domestic conflict turns his life into something almost inescapable, rather than narrative-driven. There is no comforting arc of growth, only escalation, collapse, and repetition. And in that sense, the interpretation is dark, not just because of the subject matter, but because it denies the audience catharsis. LaMotta is not mythologized or softened. He is observed as someone fundamentally stuck in his own destructive pattern, with no clean transformation or redemption point to resolve the story. Raging Bull was produced by Robert Chartworth and Aaron Winkler, and the production setup matters because the film is not a neutral adaptation of LaMotta's autobiography. It's instead an selective interpretive transformation, and of it through Sorge's artistic lens. LaMotta's book Raging Bull, My Story, is a first-person account that already attempts to justify and explain his behavior. But the production team strip away much of that self-justification and instead reshape the story into something far more ambiguous and punishing. That creative control directly affects both narrative and honesty. Instead of presenting LaMotta's life as he explains it, the film reframes it as an interior psychological study of rage, insecurity, and self-destruction. This means the movie is arguably less accurate in a literal sense, but more emotionally or thematically truthful in how it portrays violence and masculinity. In practice, that production authority allows the film to compress timelines heavily, intensify relationships, especially with wife and brother, and emphasize mood and repetition over factual balance. So the honesty of Raging Bull is not journalistic honesty, it's authorial honesty. Scorsese isn't trying to reproduce LaMotta's version of events. He's using it as raw material to construct a vision of self-destruction that feels psychologically consistent, even if it departs from strict biography. And that's why it works so well. It represents the opposite of sanitized biopics. It doesn't smooth the subject, it distorts him deliberately to reveal something darker underneath. Rashawn Prince wrote in 2017, Raging Bull pulls no punches in its depiction of violence, both physical and domestic. It shows characters at their worst, a world where morality is often forgotten about. It has a main character that few would find appealing, but that's the genius of Shorty. He makes us care about these characters, and at the end of the film, we generally have compassion after watching LaMotta achieve some sort of redemption. The film is so realistic, and there's a level of intimacy of the storytelling that audiences want to see in biopics. The film shows how LaMotta's instincts destroys not only his relationships but also his career. And it's a true story, but it worked as a movie because it was pure fiction, because it was impersonal, but also cinematic when it needs to be. It leaves an artistic imprint on the viewer. Just so you know, I don't believe that every biopic needs to tear down its main character, but I think it definitely should show the complexities of the person and leave us feeling like we understand the person more on a deeper level, because we need to take risks in cinema. And the same is also said with the 1993 film What's Love Got to Do with It? What's Love Got to Do with It reframes Tina Turner's life by centering trauma rather than legacy. The 1993 biopic starring Angela Bassett was described by film critic Roger Ebert as one of the most harrowing, uncompromising showbiz biographies I've ever seen. If you don't know, the film tells the story of her life from the time she was a little girl called Anna Mae Bullock in Tennessee, who apparently sang louder than anyone else through the church choir, through her introduction to Ike Turner, who was an established musician at the time, and then tracks the deterioration of their relationship, with Ike apparently jealous of his wife's talents and turning into a violent abuser. Instead of building towards stardom as the ultimate goal, the film presents success as something that only becomes possible after survival. The film, directed by Brian Gibson, plays attention to all facets of Tina's life. Her relationship with Ike Turner dominates the narrative, not as a side conflict, but as a defining force shaping her life. This shifts the emotional core. The audience isn't watching a rise to fame, but an escape from control and violence. And in doing so, the film rejects the celebratory tone typical of biopics and replaces it with something far more unsettling and grounded. It rejects the myth of genius by refusing to portray Tina's success as inevitable or purely talent-driven. Unlike traditional biopics that elevate their subjects into near mythical figures, the film shows how her career was shaped and constrained by abuse from Ike Turner and the industry around her. In 1981, Tina Turner was trying to establish herself as a solo artist when she revealed the truth of her abusive marriage to Ike Turner, and it was difficult to speak publicly about the brutality she faced at the hands of her ex-husband, manager and band partner at the time, when abuse at the time was not openly discussed. Her 1978 divorce had left her broke, in debt for cancelled Ike and Tina tour dates, and with sons to support. And I need to note here that the public at the time did not understand why most of the iconic music partnerships of the 60s and 70s had suddenly dissolved, and record companies were hesitant to sign her as a solo artist. And in 2021, Tina said, "I wanted to stop people thinking that Ike and Tina were so positive, that we were such a great team. So I thought, if nothing else, at least people know." The pain of her marriage to Ike has been spoken about in her 1986 memoir, I, Tina, which was an inspiration by the film. And by stripping away the idea that greatness naturally rises to the top, the film presents success as fragile and hard-won, undermining the comforting illusion that geniuses always prevails. It uses abuse not as a subplot or background obstacle, but as the actual structure of the narrative itself. Rather than treating violence from Ike Turner as a temporary conflict that leads to eventual success, the film repeatedly turns to it as the organising rhythm of Tina Turner's early life. This is what makes it feel darker than conventional biopics. In many music biopics, suffering exists to justify success. It is something to overcome and then leave behind. Here, however, the abuse is persistent enough that it resists being neatly resolved within the runtime. Even moments of professional achievement feel structurally entangled with personal instability rather than separate from it. So the film's narrative logic is closer to endurance than it is ascent. It forces the audience to sit inside repetition rather than progress, which creates discomfort but also a stronger sense of reality. The structure itself communicates the central idea that her life was not defined by a rise to fame, but by surviving something that continually interrupted that possibility. What's interesting about the biopics is that compared to now, with many acts resembling or having heavy making or prosthetic looks as much as possible so that the actor looks like who they're playing, that didn't happen with Angela Bassett. There was an intense casting process at the time with names such as Halle Berry, Robin Givens, Whitney Houston, Janet Jackson, and Vanessa L. Williams, who were considered to play Tina Turner. Whitney Houston was actually initially offered the lead role, but had to turn it down due to a pregnancy with Bobby Christina at the time. Jennifer Lewis, who auditioned for the role of Tina, actually ends up playing Tina's mother in the film, despite her only being 2 years older than Angela Bassett. Lol. It's still important to understand, however, that the film blends elements of fiction and reality to craft the narrative. While the film captures the essence of Tina Turner's remarkable journey, it is important to distinguish between the fictionalized elements created for dramatic effect and the true events that shaped the lives of Tina and Ike Turner. For instance, the infamous Eat the Cake anime scene in the film is an exaggerated reenactment of an incident that occurred during their early years of success. Tina recalled a moment where they stopped to order food and someone brought her a pound cake while they were sitting in the car. Although Tina claims she did not order it, Ike ordered her to eat the entire cake while he watched. This scene serves as a metaphorical representation of the control and dominance Ike exerted over Tina during their relationship. Whether Tina liked the movie was different. Bassett actually said, early on she did not see the film. I remember when we went to Italy, she claimed that she did not see the film. Maybe 20 years ago we were together and she took me aside and said, "You played me so well, thank you." But even though she did not see the film early on, she was there every step of the way. She was there at rehearsals. She was there at Nyman's buying me blouses for I Might Have Been Queen. Tina said she did wish the film had not portrayed her as a victim. In 2028, she told Oprah Winfrey that she had recently watched the film and said, "I watched a little bit of it, but I didn't finish it because that was not how things went. I didn't realize I would change the details so much." But why? As I said, it was shaped by Tina Turner's own published autobiography, I, Tina. That means the film's truth is already pre-filtered through her perspective before a single frame is shot. This matters because autobiographical sources are not neutral. Tina Turner's memoir is explicitly a reclaiming of narrative control after years of public and private misrepresentation. So when Kate Lehner adapts it into a screenplay form, the structure is not built around balanced dual perspectives. It's built around testimony. The result is that the film inherits a strong directorial bias. It privileges Tina's emotional and psychological experience over Ike's internal complexity. And from a narrative standpoint, this creates a very specific effect. Ike Turner is not written as a fully symmetrical co-lead in a relationship story. Instead, he functions as a central oppressive force within Tina's point of view structure. That's why his characterization feels less exploratory and more definitive, is anchored in the memoir's need to establish what happened, rather than to interrogate multiple interpretations. Touchstone Pictures, who's under Disney, also played a quiet but important role in the film. While the film was not heavily sanitized into a feel-good story, the studio system still shapes form. The narrative is streamlined, emotionally legible, and structured for mainstream biopic clarity. That combination, memoir-driven perspective, and studio narrative formatting produces something very specific. A biopic that feels less like an open investigation and more like a cinematic legal testimony with emotional framing. So the darkness here isn't just in the subject matter, is in the fact that the film is constructed to feel like a validated account of harm, rather than a balanced historical reconstruction. And I think that's what makes this movie probably one of the best biopics of all time, is that many people didn't even know that all these things that happened in the film happened. What's love got to do with it? Unrageable represents two different ways biopics can become dark interpretations of a life. And together they expose what most conventional biopics avoid. These films show that a darker biopic is not simply one that includes suffering, but one that refuses to smooth it into inspiration. One centers survival without mythologizing it, while the other centers destruction without explaining it away. And in both cases, the result is a rejection of the standard biopic formula, where pain exists only to be overcome, and instead presents lives that remain uncomfortable, unsolved, and psychologically complex. Part 3. The sanitization pipeline. Now let's get into the main event, Michael. I'm gonna be real, I think part of the problem with this film is that people have started to misunderstand what Michael Jackson actually represents. We use the word generational so often that it loses any real position. A generational artist is supposed to define a specific era. someone whose work captures a moment in time so clearly that it becomes inseparable from it. Michael Jackson doesn't fit that definition. If anything, he breaks into it entirely. He isn't tied to one generation. He moves through them all. His music doesn't belong to a single moment. It keeps reappearing, recontextualized, and rediscovered. People who were never alive during his peak still respond to it instinctively, as if it exists outside of time rather than within it. That kind of reach, guys, isn't normal. It isn't the result of timing or marketing or industry positioning. It's something far rarer, something that resists explanation as much as it invites it. And that's low-key where the difficulty begins. Trying to compress that kind of cultural presence into a conventional film like Michael is almost contradictory by nature. And so the question is not, did the film give us anything? The question is, did it give us something true? And kind of? Like millions of other people, I saw it literally on the day it came out, all right? I was having no spoilers. And then a few weeks later. The film of Michael Jackson's rise to global stardom has broken the record for the biggest opening in biopic history and made £116 million worldwide on its first weekend of release, with over $900 million projected by the end of its run. The film features its late superstar's own nephew, as we know, Jafar Jackson, in the role and in his feature film debut. And it's interesting because we know these films are often sanitized, that have their estates and lawyers who have basically rewritten the entire chapters of the musicians' lives. But we still go in for it. We still want to see it. And there's obviously an explanation for that. The biopics give us, the audience, a way to experience a favorite artist at their peak and to dip into their much-loved musical catalogue. But another part of it lies in our attitude to genius and our need to try to explain it. We want to know where the music and the artistry came from. We want the childhood, the life-changing experiences that produce the great hits. The promise of the biopic is that it will unlock the person behind the icon. And in the case of Michael, that limitation becomes especially clear. The film ends in the late 1980s, avoiding entirely the allegations that came to define the later years of Michael Jackson's life. Those accusations, which he consistently denied, are not a footnote. They are central to understanding how his legacy is debated today. Removing them doesn't simplify the story, it instead kind of distorts it. And this absence isn't accidental. With the Jackson estate involved in production, legal and reputational boundaries inevitably shape what can and cannot be shown. Reports that parts of the film were rewritten or removed due to legal constraints only reinforce the idea that this isn't a fully open interpretation, it's a controlled one. What remains then is a film that leans heavily on performance and spectacle, including Jafar Jackson's amazing physical portrayal, but offers limited insight into the contradictions of the person himself. There are glimpses of something more complex, his attachment to the fantasy, the construction of Neverland, the senses of escapism, but these ideas are never fully explored. Instead, the narrative locates moral clarity in external figures like his father Joseph. But the more difficult question, what happens when the subject himself becomes morally ambiguous, is left largely untouched. And without that, the portrait feels incomplete, because a life like Michael Jackson's cannot be understood by only examining the part that are easiest to present. There were two major things that were left out that I believe should have been in the film. There was no mention of his time making The Wiz, where he developed a bond with Quincy Jones to create one of the best artist-producer duos of all time. And there's actually a song that Michael sings in there, like, "You Can't Get Out." And I think even though The Wiz was so early on in his career, he was already explaining to people how he already feels trapped in this system. And for them to leave that out at such an early stage, why? Why? It also leaves out Michael's massive purchase of a bulk of the Beatles catalogue. Diana Ross was notably absent due to certain legal considerations, and Janet Jackson unfortunately declined to participate. Nadia Kamani wrote that the turning point was 2018's Freddie Mercury's biopic Bohemian Rhapsody, which was a commercial triumph, despite being widely criticised for the glossing over for Queen's frontman's sexuality and AIDS diagnosis. The lesson Hollywood drew was not that audiences want complexity, but that they will come regardless. The film lasts just over 2 hours and we hope will lead on to a sequel, but it is tasked with covering the first 26 years of Jackson's life and nearly 2 decades of his career. And I will admit that is a tough thing for any film. But one of the clearest advantages of the Jackson's estate involvement in Michael is the access to the music. The film is packed with songs that defined his career and global appeal, turning many sequences into polished, high-impact performances. But that access comes with a trade-off. The film constructs a version of Michael that feels curiously isolated, yet strangely complicated. His family, his siblings, and his mother are portrayed as unwaveringly supportive, with tension largely redirected towards his father, Joseph. Outside of that, his relationships are limited, often professional rather than personal, leaving him less like a fully social figure and more like someone existing in a controlled environment built around his talent. What could be defined as struggles instead becomes passing elements secondary to performance and image. And this is where the film stops being just about Michael Jackson and starts revealing something broader about biopics themselves. Faced with complexity, contradiction, and discomfort, many biopics don't confront these elements. They manage them. They redistribute tension, soften edges, and prioritize cohesion over truth. The result is a narrative that feels complete, but only because its most difficult questions have been carefully avoided. So that becomes especially clear in the film's last few scenes. Reports suggest that it was significantly reworked due to legal issues tied to allegations against Jackson. And rather than engaging with those events, which I don't think they could, and their impact, the theme shifts towards spectacle, leaning into the musical sequences instead of confrontation. And in doing so, it follows a familiar pattern. When reality becomes too risky or complicated, the biopic retreats into performance, into what is safe, recognizable, and ultimately easier to present. Joe George writes, "On those terms, Michael is very much by the numbers modern musical biopic. It whisks the viewer from year to year, pausing to recreate iconic moments and playing wall-to-wall hit songs. But in an effort to completely avoid the sexual abuse allegations and general oddness that marked the artist's later life, Michael doesn't just soften the edges of the subject, it completely transfigures Michael Jackson, framing him as a cosmic force for good, loved by everyone except his diabolical father, Joseph." Joe Jackson was a man created in a generation that did not have the luxury of emotional language. He came up in the 1920s and 30s, and that is the era of survival. Working class black families in that period weren't just doing nothing. They literally had no other way but to survive. And so they were doing whatever it took to make sure their children had something that they didn't. Joseph Jackson and his son didn't seem to exist in the same emotional space. They're expressing something similar: care, expectation, ambition, but in ways that never fully connect. Joe recognizes the talent and invests everything into shaping it. Michael, on the other hand, wants to be recognized beyond it. One is trying to prove love through discipline and sacrifice. The other is searching for something more direct, more personal. And it's in that gap that a lot of the film's quiet tension sits. The film quietly suggests that visibility isn't the same as being understood, but it kind of does nothing to actually make us understand him, except for his mom, played by Nia Long, and Berry Gordy, played by Lorraine Tate. Even now, however, reports from the film's production suggest that Nia Long allegedly publicly addressed frustration over pay disparity on the project. She's implied that her compensation was not equal to that of her male co-stars, and she had to advocate for fairer pay during negotiations. And I want to be clear that if I was to rate the film, I would give it a 7.5/8. And that's because the film always works because of the central performances. Jafar Jackson, guys, is like amazing. He is amazing. He literally embodies both the gentle warmth of this movie's Michael and can do like the dance moves of the real performer. Like, what Jafar does in this film like goes beyond imitation. His impersonation stays on the surface. The gestures, posture, voice, the visible markers of recognition, it literally feels more of an embodiment than a replication. Like, he doesn't just recreate Michael Jackson from the outside, he seems to work from within the performance itself. The physical details are precise, the movements, the rhythm, the control, and what stands out more is the emotional texture underneath them. Even in moments of performance, there's a quality in his eyes, like something that I can't describe, I'm not gonna lie. It creates a feeling that you're not just watching him, but literally just being there and encountering him in person. Like, when I was watching it, I felt like this is the closest I will ever get to a Michael Jackson concert. For real. The film asks the audience to forget anything that might complicate its subject. It doesn't just omit certain parts of Michael Jackson's life. It actively redirects attention away from them. The uncertain aspects of his public image and the allegations that continue to shape his legacy are pushed out of frame. In their place, the film encounters a far simpler memory: the music, the performances, the cultural impact. And within this version, responsibility is neatly reassigned. Any darkness is externalized, most clearly through the figure of his father Joseph, allowing the narrative to preserve Michael himself as fundamentally untarnished. This isn't unusual, as I said, for biopics, as they lean towards protection rather than interrogation. The result is a film that functions less as exploration of a life and more as an act of preservation. The music is still powerful, but the portrayal around it becomes difficult to engage with the film as a critical work. Instead, it plays more like a carefully constructed tribute, one that asks for admiration rather than reflection. And this is hard for viewers to engage in sometimes, especially when the last potentially 10 years of Michael's life was basically him on the decline from the stardom, the king of pop, and one of the most popular entertainers of all time, to be honest. And so even though I love the film, and I don't know if I would see it a third time at this point, I think, as I said, biopics just have so many flaws that unfortunately Michael does play into. But I think how good Jafar plays into his uncle just kind of makes us forget who Michael is behind the curtain. Coming towards the end of my video, I want to say that the truth is worth telling, but I do understand that the nature of biopics can make us feel like, what's the point? By playing it safe, it can never be seen as memorable. But low-key, we don't really need biopics to understand stars. There are already countless documentaries, interviews, books that offer deeper, more direct access to the truth that we are desiring. They can sit with complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty in a way that biopics often can't. So maybe the issue isn't whether biopics are good or bad, it's that they exist in a space where truth is constantly being negotiated and rewritten. And in trying to appeal to everyone, they often end up revealing less than the stories we already have and know. And so I want to thank you all for getting to the end of my video. I was really excited to make this video. I hope that it comes out the way that I want it to. If you got here, please leave a dancing icon, a hat to represent Michael in the comments, something to let me know you got to the end of this video. But thank you so much for getting here. If you're here, you might as well like, comment, and subscribe. Please do make sure that you subscribe to my Substack at Serena the Journalist, where I write about culture more frequently than my YouTube videos because these do take long. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for listening. I'm Serena the Journalist. Please do engage, as I do read my comments and actively answer some of them. So yeah, hopefully see you guys for another video soon.